Hello and welcome back to another and final episode of the story of Elizabeth I. This time, part 2. If you remember back from the last time, we had talked about how there were now two kinds of Christians in Western Europe at this time, thanks to Henry VIII and his desire to split the church and create the Church of England, no longer listening to the Pope. So now we've got two kinds. The Catholic Christians who pray to Mary and the saints. They go to the church service called Mass, and they believe that the Pope is the emissary of God who speaks and gives advice of what God thinks. On the other side are folks like the Church of England, who call themselves Protestants, protesting against the Catholic Church. And they are led by usually pastors who can get married instead of priests who can't in the Catholic faith. And these kind of Christians believe that the Bible has more authority and should be listened to more than what church leaders have to say. Well, as we know, England has some problems between Catholics and Protestants. And where we last left off, we had a whole cast of characters. Well, introducing some new ones today, we're going to be hearing about Elizabeth, of course, her sister Mary. The prime difference between the two of these is that Elizabeth, like her dad, Henry, is Protestant, and Mary, her sister, her older sister, is definitely Catholic, like Mary's mom. And introducing a new character, Philip, the King of Spain. Then there's another Mary, not to make this too complicated, but she is the cousin of Elizabeth and Mary, and she rules over Scotland. And then you've got Francis Drake, a world-class sailor and captain of a ship. We're going to hear about all five of these really shortly. I want to introduce you to a year. The year is 1588. That's going to be a super important year in the life of Queen Elizabeth, and we're going to find out why. When we left off, we know that King Henry VIII had left a son in charge who didn't last that long, Edward VI. Edward was Protestant, but when he died, Mary took over. Mary was not Protestant. She was Catholic, and definitely wanted England to become Catholic again, like it was before Henry VIII started up the Church of England. Elizabeth always had to be on her best behavior. In fact, for 1 year, she was locked in the Tower, believing that she might have something to do with a plot against Mary to remove Catholicism. So Elizabeth had to learn to play it really cool while Mary was in charge. Looking at the world today, you've got England that Mary ruled over with Elizabeth the next in line for the throne, and above England is Scotland. Scotland was also Catholic. England, however, as the Church of England, was a Protestant country. Well, except that they had a Catholic ruler named Mary at the time. The strongest of all Catholic powers is Spain at this moment. Spain has huge amounts of money coming in because of all of the treasure, gold, and silver they're taking from the Americas and bringing it over along a route called the Spanish Main. Spain is ruled by a man named Philip. King Philip has an unusual offer. He looks at Mary, who's ruling over England, and notices that she's Catholic. He notices that England has a lot of Protestant problems, so the King of Spain, Philip, says, "Hey, I know how we can solve this. Mary, why don't you marry me, and together, as king and queen of Spain and England, we'll have the power to stop these Protestants dead in their tracks." Mary agrees, so the two of them get married. Mary always wants to have a kid, because then that kid will be the next in line for the throne instead of Elizabeth. But she's never able to have a child. And also England, which is mostly Protestant, doesn't like Philip at all, and believes that if Mary ever dies, then Philip is going to basically take over all the power in England because he is technically the king. So they draw up a law where Philip is no longer allowed to have any control over England in the case of Mary's death. Philip has his sights on a country sort of nearby England called the Netherlands. Netherlands is also the next place where Protestantism has popped up, and Philip is sending in troops to try to take out the Protestant influence, because he, as a strong Catholic, believes that the Protestant faith is a heresy and should be routed out and destroyed. Philip sends a huge number of soldiers over to the Netherlands to stop this Protestant turning of the tide. And his wife is not much different. Mary is known by the nickname Bloody Mary because she decides to find all of the loudest and strongest Protestants and burn them at stake. 250 in one day, in fact, earns her the title Bloody Mary, which is where some of you may have heard the title before. Mary would like to do more to make England a Catholic place, but she's unable to because Mary, dies of disease and sickness. And when that happens, the throne goes to her younger sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is only 25 years old when she becomes Queen of England. Just like Mary had Elizabeth as next in line for the throne, Elizabeth also has to have a next in line in case something happens to her. And the very closest member of the family, really the only member of the family left, is her distant cousin who rules over Scotland. Another Mary, this one, Mary Queen of Scotland, or Mary Queen of Scots. Well, as we remember, England is fighting between Catholicism and Protestant. And this means there's a lot of armed conflict going on between those two sides in England. So one of Elizabeth's first order of business is to try to stop the warfare with the Uniformity Act and to say that if you're a Protestant, then you're a part of England. And if you're Catholic and you're quiet about it, you're still a part of England. But if you're a really loud Catholic and you won't stop talking about how England should be Catholic, then you have to leave the country. Well, Elizabeth has contact with Spanish King Philip, who was her brother-in-law, because he was married to Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary. But when Mary died, Philip has a second question. He says to Elizabeth, I was married to your sister. Now that she's dead, how about I marry you instead? Elizabeth's answer is a really flat-out no. And this means Philip can't stay in charge of England anymore. In fact, as we know, Queen Elizabeth is never going to marry anybody. This is going to be one point of contention and fighting between Spain and England. It's not the only one. Elizabeth knows Spain is drawing in some huge amounts of money, so she decides to send out sea captains to act as privateers with a permission from England to take over Spanish goods and basically to capture as many Spanish ships as they can. Also, she sends over English soldiers to fight off Spanish soldiers coming to the Netherlands to allow the Protestant faith to grow in the Netherlands just like it has in England. These are two more things that are going to make Spain really mad. One of the guys that she sends over to be a sea captain and take away Spanish gold is this dude, Francis Drake, who's known as a sea dog because he does whatever it takes to take Spanish gold and make England richer. Here he is aboard his Golden Hind, the name of his ship. By all accounts, Francis Drake was a pretty good-looking guy, and that was one reason why he was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth. At the same time, Queen Elizabeth is not so happy with her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, because she's been indicted many times as trying to help out plots to stop Queen Elizabeth, get Queen Elizabeth killed off, and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots as the next Catholic ruler. A lot of Catholics want Queen Elizabeth dead. So Mary Queen of Scots is locked up in the Tower, and she's played a lot of bad mistakes to get there. Queen Elizabeth is basically told by her advisors all the time, you've got to execute Mary if you ever want to make your throne safe. Elizabeth doesn't want to do this because it is her cousin, and she remembers what it's like to be in fear of having her head chopped off. But it gets a little more complicated. Remember Philip, the King of Spain? He comes to Mary with a question. Since I can't marry Elizabeth and take the English throne that way, says Philip, and you're Catholic, why don't you marry me instead? This is an offer that Philip extends to Mary Queen of Scots. But since Queen Elizabeth is technically in charge of England and making sure that Mary Queen of Scots is locked away, she says no to this offer as well. King Philip just can't marry any of these English girls for long. Finally, there comes a time where Queen Elizabeth orders the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. We think that maybe because she really protested that after this she was tricked into signing the paperwork and didn't know what she was signing, that maybe Elizabeth didn't actually know that she was ordering the execution of her cousin. In any case, Mary's head is chopped, and King Philip of Spain just throws a fuse, gets really angry. This is the last straw for Spain. Not only is the last possible Catholic monarch executed, but his ships have been stolen from by English ships, and Queen Elizabeth has sent a whole bunch of troops to the Netherlands to stop his Spanish soldiers. He is done with England. And the next step in the year 1587 is that King Francis of Spain sends the biggest known number of ships ever to set sail to attack another country in the Spanish Armada, going with one purpose: to totally destroy England's forces and make it into a Catholic country through whatever means necessary. Remember when I mentioned the year 1588? Well, this is the big day for England. It's going to either become a Spanish slave or it will become victorious against the Spanish Armada. Now, this is going to be easier said than done because Spain has a huge number of ships, way outclassing whatever England has. They have ships, men of war, large galleons, just loaded to the brim with over 55,000 soldiers ready to take on England. In contrast, England, which is led by now Admiral Francis Drake, is a lot smaller with smaller and faster ships. It's going to be a miracle for them to be able to defeat Spain. So enter Queen Elizabeth. At one city called Tilbury in England, along a port, Queen Elizabeth arrives on horseback, and she's wearing breastplate armor, and she speaks to her crowds of people. We're not really sure what she says, but a couple of the accounts give this really inspiring account of Queen Elizabeth giving a pep speech to her people at Tilbury, saying probably, "Let tyrants fear," that she might be a woman, and maybe that means that she's feeble and weak in a lot of people's eyes, but she has the heart and the stomach of a king, and a king of England too. This is going to really inspire her men to fight as hard as they can for the freedom of England. Also, remember, Sir Francis Drake is in charge of the ships, and he's a really smart guy. What he does when he first takes care of some Spanish ships by destroying their supplies, by removing the cork factories, he next, in 1588, sends in some of his ships into the Spanish harbor of Cadiz. Cadiz is where, in order to get away from the crazy winds of that summer, all these Spanish ships are lashed together, hundreds of them, up close so they don't knock against each other. And because of this, Sir Francis Drake sets fire to his own ships. That's right, he sets fire to his own ships, 8 of them, and sends these fire ships into the harbor of Cadiz, which basically means he's sending fireballs on the water to crash land into these Spanish ships and set fire to them. The Spanish ships try to get away when they see these huge fiery ships coming into their harbor, but they're lashed so close together that they start crashing into each other to try to get out, and dozens of Spanish ships burn up in the harbor. Sir Francis Drake has done a pretty impressive job. He's made it to a knight by Queen Elizabeth for all of his heroics. Not only this, but because Spain has humongous, heavy ships, they can't move as fast. And English ships are able to move around and fire using superior cannons and faster ships. They're able to make light work of a lot of the Spanish ships. Not only that, but as Spanish ships are forced because of the weather to move back away from England, a humongous storm comes just out of nowhere, and it completely demolishes half of the Spanish fleet. Even though they outnumber the English ships, they get totally destroyed in this huge storm. Imagine how King Philip of Spain feels when he sees half of his fleet come back, destroyed, weakened, some of it with starving and diseased men, some of whom are going to die later on in Spanish hospitals. He is astonished that God did not help the Catholic faith to destroy the English heretics. In the meantime, England sees this as God must be on our side, because Queen Elizabeth even has medals made that she bestows upon her war heroes, saying, this is a day where God allows for the Protestants to have a victory over the Catholics. In fact, this is a huge victory for Protestants everywhere. Portugal, which is right next to Spain, has a little rebellion that involves a lot of Protestants. The Netherlands are able to stay Protestant because the Spanish have to pull back their forces, and England stays, for the most part, Protestant for many, many years to come. In fact, on the little medals, Queen Elizabeth has the words, God blew and they scattered, talking about the Spanish Armada. Queen Elizabeth goes on to reign in England for many more years, and finally, in the year 1603, after a very renowned and successful reign, she dies as an old queen, having ruled for nearly 45 years on the throne. But she doesn't have any kids, having never married as the Virgin Queen, and now England has to look for a new ruler. The only successive line of family members left would have gone to Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, but Mary is dead, long time before, having her head chopped off. And so, ironically, the throne is then given to Mary's son, whose name is James. James would become the next ruler of England, and his line would carry on to some pretty crazy stories in English history. Well, that's a wrap for part 2 and the final segment of the life of Queen Elizabeth I. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy.